You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Hey, everybody. I hope you're doing well. A few weeks ago, after being on the Today Show, one of the guys who was on with us also has a very, very successful Instagram page. I'm not sure, but I'm guessing maybe the most successful Instagram page, Civil War Instagram page, I should say, American Civil War _IG. Those of you who are patrons, you know him. We interviewed him a few months back. His name is Donny Copper. He was on a local radio station, I believe it's in Butler, Pennsylvania, where he lives. It's WISR, the Extended News at Noon. He did an interview. He's been on there a few times. Don't know why he hasn't worked his magic to get me on there, but whatever. Anyway, he was on to talk about being on the Today Show, and he did a lot of plugging for Addressing Gettysburg there. And that was nice because I didn't know he was going to be on. I think he recorded the interview and then said, hey, I'm going to be on the radio at 12:30. Of course, none of us live out there, so we couldn't hear it, but we got to listen to it on the internet. And anyway, I thought I would get permission to share it with you guys, and permission has been granted. So here it is. Here's Donny Copper talking about the Civil War, his love of the Civil War, his love of Gettysburg, being on the Today Show, how wonderful I am, and I'm sorry. I can't even say that as a joke without gagging a little and then laughing. About addressing Gettysburg and all the things that we do. And that's pretty much it. And then, of course, we got to get in at the end that he is a big hero and he flies around the world saving lives. And okay, Donnie's wonderful. Okay, we get it, guys. But anyway, he really is wonderful. He's a great friend of mine and a great friend of the show. And listen to him on the radio. He does a great job. And that's it. Here it is.
And welcome back to your Extended News at Noon. Tracy Morgan with you. On the phone with me is Donny Copper. He's been on the radio station before in the past. He's a local historian. And the reason I wanted to talk to him is because we were able to see him on the Today Show a while ago. Now, of course, the Today Show on NBC. And he was able to talk about Gettysburg. We'll talk about how you can still access the clip here in just a moment. But Donny, thank you so much for joining me on the phone. I appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Should I get in line to get your autograph now, or do we wait for that? The Today Show, how fun. How did you get connected with the Today Show?
Well, there's a group of us who, during this whole pandemic, we kind of bonded through various social media platforms. And we were looking for some kind of an outlet where we could get together and discuss history. And, we actually turned it into several Zoom calls. We were doing a couple Zoom calls a week. And it started out as just a roundtable discussion, but then it turned into one night we would have a trivia night and we would give away prizes and stuff. And this group slowly got bigger over the months. And one of the people who was in the group, she's a public relations director out of Miami, Florida. And she has friends who work for the Today Show. And so she pitched the idea to them about making friendships during the pandemic, and they loved the idea, so they ran with it.
So did they do a segment about Gettysburg in particular, or did they do a segment about this particular group?
It was actually about our group and how our bond was formed through a love of history. And the main guy who started the group is a friend of mine by the name of Matt Callery, who lives in Gettysburg. And he started a podcast a couple of years ago, and he contacted me about coming on and helping promote his podcast. Well, through him, this group formed. And so they kind of spotlighted him and his love of history and how he promotes the city of Gettysburg and how we get together a few times a year out in Gettysburg, and we do tours on the battlefield.
So you are one of the individuals out on the tours. Do you dress up or do you stay in plain clothes?
I personally don't. We don't, I myself, I don't give the tours. I go to be a part of it.
Okay.
But we actually bring in licensed battlefield guides, and we pay them to give us like an exclusive tour of things that, they don't normally give on regular tours.
See, and I think that's fascinating. I'm one of those people in society that I love history. I love visiting it. I love being, I'm that hands-on person. As soon as I leave it, I forget all the details. I'm like, wait a minute, what was that day again? And can you remind me? So it's not that I don't love history. It just, I don't retain it very well. But so that's why I'm intrigued in what you do. And how do you retain all of this, the facts and the figures and the dates? And do you just go with the Civil War, or do you like history in general?
I do have a love of history in general, but how I got involved in this in the beginning was my specific love of American Civil War history led me to create an Instagram page as kind of like an outlet. And I put posts on there, daily posts. I post, something that may have happened on this day in the Civil War, or just, like I pick a soldier that, I have information on, and I'll put that out there, and it kind of took off. It became pretty popular. I didn't expect it to, but it did. And I've gotten like 35,000 followers now. And so in addition to putting stuff out there for other people to learn, it forces me to do my research, and I'm learning new things every day.
Yeah.
As far as the retention goes, I probably don't retain a whole lot of it unless it's something that's really, mind blowing or something like that. But I do have a lot of reference materials that I use, and I still have to go back and look at them from time to time to make sure I get my dates right.
But you're more the professional than I am when it comes to history. So I'd be asking you all the questions. That's why we're here, right? I'm asking you all the questions. So after NBC, did your Instagram page kind of blow up? Did you get an increase in followers?
It wasn't. I don't think it was any more than what I normally gain in a given day. I do know that my friend Matt's Addressing Gettysburg podcast, he did gain a few more followers through this. We're still getting a lot of hits on it because it did go out to like YouTube and MSNBC, and there's a couple other links out there, and they actually gave us the numbers as far as like the reach and stuff goes, and it actually hit probably about a reach of about 100 million.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
First few days. Yeah,
I'm not surprised at all. Again, that's the Today Show with NBC, but you're also referencing MSNBC, so you have a great following just in those networks. So that's fabulous. I'm just so excited for you. I think that's a lot of fun to be able to get national attention. Right. Now, can people join your group, or do they have to have certain requirements? If they wanted to join your group online, do they have to be a historian, or can we just want to be there to learn? Like, who's all a part of this group?
Well, we have a mix of people from all walks. Like there are people that do reenacting, and they have like the full get up, and these guys have been studying this their entire lives. We have some people who work for the National Park Service, who are park rangers, who have a degree in this and are paid to do it. And there are some people that are just doing it for fun, and some people that have just the basic minimal knowledge that are looking to learn more. I always recommend to people to look up my friend Matt at his podcast is called Addressing Gettysburg, and his Instagram page is called Addressing Gettysburg, and he kind of runs the whole thing. My page is called American Civil War, like with no spaces, and then an _IG for Instagram. And through us, I mean, you could contact either one of us, and we could set you up with the details of it all. We welcome anybody. We have, people of all ages. It was surprising because there's a thing on Instagram where you can check the demographics of the people who follow you. And, I just expected it to be, a bunch of old men.
A certain demographic. Yeah.
Right. But, it's surprisingly enough, I have just as many females as I do males. I have just as many young people as I do older people. I mean, I think it's something that, the popularity of history kind of waxes and wanes depending on the anniversaries that come around. Like when the Gettysburg 150th anniversary came around, that kind of shot the popularity of it up.
Right, yeah. And I think one of the reasons why I love going to visit locations, because I am that learner who has to have that hands-on approach, and that's fine. We all learn differently. But when I'm in like an old home or a Civil War era location, to me, it starts to sink in how easy it was not back then. I mean, how easy we have it right now. The restrooms, where they are, and the clothing that the soldiers wore. I mean, all of that has changed. And I think that doesn't really sink in for a lot of people like me until you're right in the moment.
Absolutely. That's why I also recommend to everybody when we start to do our tours, we usually start them in April. And we do them the third weekend of every month from then until at least October. Now, I'm actually going out to Gettysburg in a couple of weeks here. We're doing it was kind of like an impromptu thing. We wanted to go out and see the battlefield during the wintertime with all the leaves and stuff down so you get a better idea, like when you're looking through the woods of the topography of the land and everything. But I tell everybody, if you come to these tours with us during the summer months, you're going to get that hands-on experience. You're going to get to see things that people don't normally see on a tour. And just for instance, when we did the tour for the Today Show in October, one of the houses that's still on the National Park Service property was owned by a man by the name of Abraham Bryant, who was actually an African-American farmer who owned a plot of land there. And this house that he lived in, it was confiscated and made into a general's headquarters, and then the Pickett's charge came through and destroyed all of his land, and he never got reimbursed for it. It's actually kind of a sad story. But the National Park Service took that house and they restored it, and they don't normally open it up to the public, but they opened it up for us so that people could go in and see this house. And when you're immersed in it like that, I don't know about everybody else, but me, I get this overwhelming feeling just being in that spot, and it's like, wow, that you can just feel the historical significance of being in a place like that.
I just recently talked to Gettysburg, and a representative was talking about the museum or their effort to get a place for these artifacts from the residents in the area. I mean, we hear a lot about the soldiers and as well as we should, and the battlefield as well as we should. But are you familiar with that effort that they're trying to showcase, if you will, what it was like to live in Gettysburg during that time?
Oh, absolutely. One of the tours that we did last summer touched on that very thing. There was a gentleman who took us on a guided tour through town, and he was pointing out, the different homes in the city itself with historical significance. And then, we read a couple of firsthand accounts of people who lived in town when the battle came through and what life was like for them before and during and even after. And that's one of the things that I think hasn't really been highlighted till now, because you have this small town there that I think at the time, Gettysburg only had a few thousand people. And, here comes these two armies that total, a couple 100,000 and, 53,000 casualties in a span of 3 days. And then the armies are gone. And now the town is left to deal with all of this carnage, the bodies that had to be buried and the wounded soldiers that were left behind that had to be taken care of. It's such a fascinating story.
When you're talking, I think of the people at that time, they would go and watch the war like it was a picnic.
Sure.
Sure. It's amazing to think about that. Is there anything that comes to mind when I ask you what strikes you the most about that time, that era in Gettysburg?
Hey, for me, it's the whole thing. What really got me started into the Civil War when I was a very young child, I lived next door to my uncle Dwight, who was a historian and a genealogist, and he bought me my first Civil War books, and he showed me the connections that we had to the Civil War. I had ancestors that fought in the war, several of them, and it just gave me a connection to it. And then, he, like I said, gave me these books, and he helped start my love of it. And then my parents took me on a camping trip to Gettysburg, and I fell in love with the town. And I felt like I couldn't get enough of it. And for me at the beginning, it was more of the romantic side of the war that everybody hears about, the romantic stories. But then as I started to dive deeper into it and read more books, you learn about the not so romantic side of it, the horrors of the war. And for me, it's all important to learn. I love all of it. And I don't know why it's specifically that time period. I mean, like I said, there's other historical time periods that I like, but nothing just ever really stuck with me like the American Civil War did.
I'm trying to remember what the building is, and the building is in history books or books that are sold about Gettysburg. My sister, at one time years ago now, lived in one of the buildings that I believe the storage for the bodies, because they had to wait for the carts to come get the bodies. That's where the bodies were stored. And it was interesting, like when we're talking about having that hands-on and being in the moment and how it really sinks in. Yeah, you can hear these stories, you can read about them, but then when we stayed at her place, it just really sinks in that you're thinking, yes, I'm in this building. Like, I'm staying the night in this building because it's turned into apartments and they've built on to the location. But still, you're like, wow, this is a little, unsettling, unnerving, intriguing. You know, it all wraps in.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been to Gettysburg probably 3 dozen times in my life, at least. And it never fails to give me that same feeling every time I walk onto that battlefield, or every time I walk into one of those historical buildings out there. I still get that same feeling, and it's very difficult to describe to anybody who's never been to Gettysburg. But once you're there, you feel it.
Right.
And
right.
It's just one of those kind of places that it like gets into you, and
it just makes you think. Yeah, it does make you think. Like when we go to eat, if we're in the area in Gettysburg, and you go down to one of the locations that's very well, probably from the time period. You know, they probably didn't change much. And you start to think, but I'm eating by candlelight. You know, if you really think about that, you know, things weren't refrigerated like they are now and cooked like they are now, and you didn't have lights. I think of the dresses when you talk about the romantic side of things. I think about the dresses and how fun it would be wear. And then you think about what you have to put on. And it's like, maybe that wasn't so much fun, you know? So it's interesting. So I'm glad to talk to you about this, because it's just interesting to talk about the Civil War and Gettysburg. And so you said you're going to take a tour. Can people sign up for that? Do they pay for that? How do they go about doing that?
So the one that we're doing here in a couple of weeks, it's just going to be an intimate one with some of the guys that are in the group. But once we start doing the actual tours for the public, again, if you go to Addressing Gettysburg, he'll have a schedule up of the meetups that we're going to do, and it usually comes out in March or April. But we do like a different one every month, and it's always the third weekend in the month. And the tours are phenomenal. You know, and like I said, coming from somebody who has studied it his whole life and has been there so many times, every time I go, I learn something new. I see something new. I'm taken somewhere where I've never been before. It's just, it's a fascinating tour. And, you know, my friend Matt has a great working relationship, great friendship with a lot of the best licensed battlefield guides in the town. And these guys are amazing. Usually it's a minimal cost. You know, we usually we ask everybody to kick over 20 or 30 bucks for the guide, just for his fees and his tip. And everything else is pretty much, you know.
Do you ride out together? Do you meet out there? Do you take a bus? What's the transportation?
It's usually on each of us to make our own way out there. But now, having said that, some of the guys who have recently joined in with the group actually live in this area as well. So, you know, some of us have started carpooling as these friendships have kind of, taken off.
Right. A couple of years ago, I mean, it's been a couple of years now since the last time I visited. I remember my kids were young, and now they're teenagers. So my question is, when we were there, they were talking about thinning out the wooded areas to resemble more of what it was like back then. Did they do that in the past few years?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, because we were actually just talking about that this morning. There's actually a few foundations who work on the battlefield, and they're in the process or have already finished restoring certain parts of the battlefield to how it actually looked in 1863. There's groups like the Friends of Gettysburg, the American Battlefield Trust, you know, groups like these that's their whole purpose is, because one of the things that happened with Gettysburg not too long after the battle is it was highly commercialized, and they built like trolley tracks across the battlefield, like these sacred grounds that everybody loves so much. Like they treated them like Disney World. And they put in like trolley rides and roads just cutting right through the battlefield. Well, now they're in the process of undoing all of that commercialization, and they're trying to restore the land back to what it was.
Now, when you say they commercialized that, do you mean like 10, 15 years after the battle, or do you mean like in recent history, like in the past 20 years?
Well, it actually started probably within 10 to 20 years after the battle, and it went on until like the 1950s, 1960s.
Are there still finds out there, artifacts? And of what I understand, it wasn't that too long ago that they did find the remains of soldiers.
Sure. Yeah. We were talking about that yesterday. It's not legal to artifact hunt on the National Park Service property. So you can't go out there with like a metal detector and start scanning for things. But, things still do turn up from time to time. That one of the remains, like you were saying, of one of the soldiers was found, I want to say it was probably about 6 or 7 years ago in an area called the Railroad Cut, which is just west of town. Apparently they found part of a bone sticking out of the ground. Just people that were walking through, they saw it. And so they called the authorities out there to excavate the area. And it turns out they could do testing on the remains to get an approximate date. And it turned out it was a soldier's remains there.
I think that's an amazing moment because, the TV show, What Would You Do? What would you do in this moment? I mean, I wonder how many people would call the authorities, because I would look at it and think, well, depending on how much of the bone was sticking out, but I'd wonder, is it just an animal or is it a body? So I respect those people who called the authorities to come out. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Because you think about how many times you're out walking in the wilderness somewhere and, there's like one little bone sitting there. An animal must have had something for lunch or whatever. Mm-hmm. You don't even think about it. But in an area like that, you gotta see something like that and think, who does that belong to?
Right. So, Donny, let me ask you, have you always loved history? Did you grow into loving history, the Civil War? What draws you to it?
It's just something I've always loved. Like I said, my uncle really played a big part in that. Several camping trips to Gettysburg, books, movies. One of my favorite movies of all time is the movie Gettysburg.
Yes.
From 1993. Mm-hmm. And actually, thanks to Matt from Addressing Gettysburg, I've actually got to meet several of the actors from the movie now. We actually have them come out to Gettysburg with us. The last tour we did, the actor Bo Brinkman, who played in the movie, he was there with us. He had dinner with us and was telling us stuff about the movie. We've had Patrick Gorman. Tom Berenger's actually going to be on the show in a couple of weeks.
I love that. Yeah.
After Tom Berenger, then we're going to start working on Martin Sheen and Jeff Daniels as well.
Oh, I love that. So remind us now, this is the podcast. Is that what you're talking about?
It is. Addressing Gettysburg. He does a podcast. There's free content and there's paid content. He has a website. He has podcasts on pretty much all platforms. I listen to it on Spotify myself, but it's on all podcasting platforms. He has an Instagram page, a Facebook page. Yep.
And your Instagram page, of course, at American Civil War, and then that _IG for Instagram. We can catch your content on Instagram and increase the 35,000 followers.
Please do.
Do we hear 40,000? Come on.
Yeah. And I love as much input as I can get. I encourage people to message me and, with their ancestors' information, because I love to do the research. My other passion is genealogy. I love genealogy. And so if there's something I can do to help somebody look up an ancestor and, find out things about where they fought and where they died at and everything, I would love to do that.
I love it. So what's the best way to contact you? Is it through Instagram?
Right. The private messaging feature, I just tell people, just send me a message. I'm usually very responsive to it. So
fabulous. Now, Donny, I'm not going to let you go without asking you about your other job. You are from Butler, you're local, but you are a life flight paramedic.
I am.
Can you tell us about that for a moment? What do you go through, especially with this past year? How are you handling that job?
You know what? I tell people it's the greatest job on earth. I love it. I love everything about it. My office is generally situated at 4,000 feet above sea level. I have the best view in the world. I've been a paramedic since 1996, and I used to work on the ambulance in Newcastle. And then I got a job working for Allegheny General Hospital in Pittsburgh in 2005. I worked in the ER down there for almost 15 years. But through Allegheny General, I got interested in working on the helicopter. So a couple of years ago, I interviewed and I was offered a job in it's been great ever since, right up until the pandemic. The pandemic has made things very tough.
So you can't fly, or how do you work around the pandemic?
So we have special masks that we have to wear that are fixed to our helmets when we're in contact with patients. But business still goes on as usual. We still have to fly people. It's been very rough. It's trying a lot of people's patience. It's wearing a lot of people thin. But we're doing pretty well with it. We're managing to make it through. Unfortunately, a couple of our people have had to take some time off to recuperate. But
right.
We're lucky to have that option to do that, take some time off. And everybody needs to, work on their mental health for something like this.
Right. So. Absolutely. And I will say thank you for what you do. When the pandemic first started, we got to talk to the firefighters and police officers and those that in the pandemic are on the front line in a different way than the hospital and the doctors. Yeah. So thank you very much for what you do. And I appreciate all that you and your crew are doing to continue to help individuals with Life Flight.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Donnie, before we go, what are your final thoughts today?
Yeah, I encourage people to, in these trying times, there's still plenty of things that you can do. Get out there. Our whole slogan last year was "Get out of the car 2020." I encourage people to go to these national parks, go to these historical places. A lot of them are outside. A lot of them are open air, and they're very safe to go visit. And just get out there and see this stuff. There's so many fascinating things to learn.
Donnie, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate your time. It's been wonderful to talk to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate it. It was great to talk to you, too.
Our hearts so stout have got us fame, forsooth 'tis known from whence we came. Wherever we go, they dread the name of Gary Owen in glory. Instead of spa, we'll drink down ale and pay the reckoning on the